This lab focuses on the integumentary system. The integumentary system includes the skin, known as the cutaneous membrane, as the major organ. And then it also includes numerous accessory structures that originate from the skin and are closely associated with the skin. This includes things like the hair, the nails, and glands that produce secretions on the surface of the skin, like oil or sweat, for example. This quick video is going to focus on the layers of the cutaneous membrane, or the layers of the skin. The skin, or cutaneous membrane, can be divided into two general regions. These are the epidermis and the dermis. The dermis is the thick, deep region of the skin. So this whole region down here is referred to as the dermis. This is an area that's made out of connective tissue, which is a vascular tissue, and you can see there are blood vessels, these red and blue tubes going through. Those are blood vessels that bring blood in and out of the dermis. And the dermis is where most of the accessory structures are anchored. So you can see that there's hair that's down here, there's a muscle, there are sweat glands. All different accessory structures are anchored deep down in this dermis. They're anchored in the dermis because it's deeper. That can allow them to be held stronger in the skin, but also because the dermis is vascular, because there's a blood supply. So the blood can deliver nutrients and oxygen to the cells that are present in these accessory structures. So this thick, deep layer of the skin is called the dermis. The top layer of the skin up here, which is a thinner layer, is called the epidermis. Epi literally means upon. So this term, epidermis, means upon the dermis. And that's where the layer sits. It sits upon the dermis, or on top of the dermis. So from this curvy line up, we have the epidermis. And then from that curvy line down to about here, we have the dermis. Technically, those two regions are the skin, or the cutaneous membrane. The area underneath is not technically part of the skin, but we study it at the same time because it's very closely associated with the skin. The area underneath the dermis is called the hypodermis. Hypo means below. So the hypodermis is literally below the dermis. And you see the hypodermis right here. This is this area that's deep to the dermis, where there's a lot of adipose tissue. All of this yellow that you see right here, this kind of chunky globular yellow, that's adipose tissue, which is just the fancy way for saying fat. Underneath the skin is where we store extra fat. This is why if you're consuming a lot of fat and you're not burning it for fuel, your body will store it, and it'll store it here in the hypodermis. That adipose tissue is where we store extra fat. And because it's right underneath the skin, when we start storing a lot of fat, you can see it accumulate, right? And the body changes shape and becomes kind of soft and more round as that fat accumulates beneath the skin. Now, the hypodermis has another name that we very commonly use. We commonly call the hypodermis, or refer to the hypodermis as the subcutaneous. As subcutaneous, or the subcutaneous area. The reason we call this subcutaneous is because it's just beneath the cutaneous membrane. Again, the cutaneous membrane, the skin, only includes the dermis and the epidermis. So this area that's right below it, right, is subcutaneous, just beneath the cutaneous membrane. Subcutaneous is a term that we use a lot in the medical field. For example, there are a lot of medications that are given subcutaneously. they're injected into the hypodermis or into this subcutaneous region. So insulin, for example, is given subcutaneously. You inject it just beneath the skin into that fatty tissue of the hypodermis. Now, these large regions, right, the epidermis and the dermis, are further broken up into smaller layers. When we look at the epidermis, this top region of the skin, it can have either 4 or 5 layers, depending on the kind of skin that you're looking at. We have 2 different types of skin covering the body. We have thick skin and thin skin. And the epidermis in thick skin is obviously thicker. So thick skin is the hairless skin, so the skin with no hair, that's present on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. That skin is obviously different, right? The palms of your hands are kind of calloused. The skin is thicker and stronger. Same thing with the bottom of your feet, because those areas are highly stressed. Right? Obviously, we walk on our feet all day long, and especially think back to when we were hunters and gatherers before we had shoes. Our feet had to withstand a lot of abuse. So it's an evolutionary benefit to have thick, strong skin on the bottom of your feet. And then our hands are our primary tools, right? Any activity that we're doing, we, for the most part, will use our hands to grab things and grip things and hold on and pull. So our hands need to be strong. So we have thick skin on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet because those areas are very highly stressed. Thin skin covers the rest of the body. Okay, so your arms, your legs, your face, your back, your belly, everywhere else is covered in thin skin. Thick skin has 5 layers in the epidermis. So in thick skin, this region up here from the curvy line up has 5 layers. In thin skin, there are only 4 layers present. So there's an extra layer in the epidermis in thick skin. That extra layer is referred to as the stratum lucidum. So the stratum lucidum is only in thick skin. It's not in thin skin. Another major difference is that the outermost layer, the stratum corneum, stratum just is like layer. So like the strata of the earth, right? These are the different strata of the epidermis, the different layers of the epidermis. The outermost layer, the stratum corneum, is very thick in thick skin. It's much thicker in thick skin than it is in thin skin. Okay, so those are the key differences. Thick skin is on the palms of the hands, soles of the feet. It's hairless. There's no hair in it. There are 5 layers in the epidermis. The extra layer is the stratum lucidum, and it has a thick outermost layer or a thick stratum corneum. Okay, thin skin only has 4 layers. It has a normal stratum corneum, and it does not have the stratum lucidum. And for the most part, thin skin has hair. Even if it's very, very fine, right? Like the hair on your forearms is typically very fine hair, but there's hair there. The only places where thin skin is hairless are the eyes, right? So portions of the eyes, the labia minora. Those are the like the hair folds that surround, or sorry, the skin folds that surround the vagina in women. The inner hair folds are the labia minora. Those do not have hair. And then portions of the penis. Everywhere else, thin skin has hair. Okay, so that's the epidermis. We'll look more at the actual specific layers on the coming up slides. Underneath the epidermis, or deep to the epidermis, we said we have the dermis, right? And the dermis is this thick layer that contains connective tissue, right? Not epithelial tissue like we have in the epidermis, but connective tissue. This dermis is separated into 2 layers or 2 regions, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. The papillary layer is the superficial region. The reticular layer is the deep region. The papillary layer is really small. It's just like from about here up. So it's just this top part of the dermis here. And then the reticular region, or the reticular layer, represents most of the dermis. When we look at the dermis, I keep telling you guys like that the epidermis is from the curvy line up, right? And the dermis is from the curvy line down. There is always these curves that you see between those two layers. And the reason is that there's not a straight line. There's not a flat attachment between the two layers. There are ridges, finger-like ridges of the dermis that stick up like this, right, in towards the epidermis. And then there are interlocking ridges that come down from the epidermis into the dermis like this. So there are interlocking ridges between these two layers. The reason for that is that it increases the surface area between the layers, and that allows them to be connected to each other much more strong. So think about it. If you had skin that went from here to here, and you have your two layers, right? Your epidermis is up here, your dermis is down here. All along that barrier, there's a basement membrane there where it connects. All along there, you have little protein connectors called hemidesmosomes. I always think of like desmosomes and hemidesmosomes as staples, right? They're like little protein staples that hold things together. Well, we have them scattered throughout here between these two layers, right? And they hold the two layers together so that they don't separate from each other. If it was a straight line between the dermis and the epidermis, right, we could fit, say, 4 hemidesmosomes. But if I had that same piece of skin, right, from here to here, and instead of a flat surface, I have these ridges, these interlocking ridges that go like this. Now I have a much greater surface area, and I can fit many more hemidesmosomes, right, or many more staples to hold the two layers together, right? The staples are still the same distance apart, but now instead of 4, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I have doubled the number of hemidesmosomes, or little protein staples, that I have holding those two layers together. So that's why those ridges are present that create that curvy line between the epidermis and the dermis. It increases surface area and allows for a stronger attachment. Now, what do we call those? The parts of the epidermis that extend down, so these little ridges that extend down, those are called epidermal ridges. And the parts of the dermis that are extending up are called dermal papilla. Okay, so dermal papilla and epidermal ridges, they interlock with each other to increase surface area. That's why we call this top area of the dermis the papillary layer, because it's where the papilla are located. That's where that term papillary layer comes from. The papilla are there. All right, so that's it for the general regions of the skin. Obviously, there's a lot of other stuff going on in this picture. You see sweat glands and sebaceous glands and hair and muscle. We'll talk about all of that in another video. Okay, this is just the layers of the skin. Okay, so now we're going to focus on the layers that are present in the epidermis, the outermost layer of the skin. Just to get your bearings, the epidermis is from the curvy line up. So from here up, this is all the epidermis, right? The dermis is underneath. Same thing over here. From this curvy line, which this is real skin over here. From the curvy line up is the epidermis. Below that is the dermis. Looking at these are both thick skin, which means the epidermis is going to have 5 layers. I know that these are thick skin for a couple different reasons. One, there is a stratum lucidum. The stratum lucidum is only present in thick skin. It's not going to be there in thin skin. Also, the stratum corneum is really, really thick, right? All of this is all a bunch of dead skin cells, just sacs filled with keratin, nice, strong, water-resistant protein. If this was thin skin, it would only be to like right here, right? So that's like 3 times as thick, 4 times as thick in thick skin. All right, so the layers of the epidermis from the bottom to the top. The acronym I use to remember these is, it's kind of sexist, but the acronym I use to remember these is boys say girls love clothes, which I do, but boys say girls love clothes. Again, all of them start with the word stratum. That just means layer. So stratum, right? Stratum, 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 stratum. So the bottom layer is the stratum basal. Then the stratum spinosum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum lucidum, and the stratum corneum. The stratum basal, think base, right? The basal layer, the base layer, the bottom layer. So the stratum basal is this one row of cells here at the very bottom. And you same thing here, this one individual row of cells at the bottom. Basal cells are the cells that divide again and again and again to make new skin cells to push up to the top. After the stratum basal, we have the stratum spinosum. The stratum spinosum is kind of thick. The cells in the stratum spinosum still have the ability to divide. So they can still divide and thicken up. The reason we call it the stratum spinosum is that when you dry out the skin to make a slide to look at it, the cells start to look like kind of spiny. So because parts of them like shrink up, and so they called it spinosum. Above the stratum spinosum, you have a layer called the stratum granulosum. In the stratum granulosum, the cells really start to look different. They are filled with granules, and these granules dry out the cell and make the nucleus disintegrate and the organelles disintegrate. And the cell produces tons and tons of keratin. And that's where they really start to change. They go from these living, functioning cells, and they turn into these just dead sacs of keratin. Since this is thick skin, above the stratum granulosum, we have the stratum lucidum. And then the most superficial layer of the skin is the stratum corneum. And the stratum corneum, again, is just dead skin cells. It's just dead sacs of keratin. And when you look at this, you see like there's not any differentiation. You don't see a plasma membrane, you don't see a nucleus, you don't see anything because the keratin cross-links. It crisscrosses between cells. So it looks almost like one full sheet, one individual piece, because everything is so cross-linked. It's not really like individual cells any longer. All right, so if this happened to be thin skin, it would not have the stratum lucidum, right? So everything else would be the same. It would go stratum basal, stratum spinosum, granulosum, and then corneum. It just would not have the stratum lucidum present. So here on this slide, you guys see a picture of the model. This happens to be the model that we use in lab. We will look at the layers of the skin on it. Of course, again, there are a lot of other structures labeled on this, and we're going to look at those later on in the lab in another video. This one is just strictly about the layers of the skin. So right off the bat, initially what we have is the general layers. Number one here is the epidermis, the outermost layer. Underneath the epidermis, we have the dermis. And then deep to the dermis, the region that's really closely associated with the skin is called the hypodermis. And what else do you call that? Hopefully you said subcutaneous. Right, subcu. The dermis can be separated into two general areas. This outermost area right here is the papillary region or papillary layer. And then the larger, deeper portion is the reticular layer or reticular region. You can see all of these little like finger-like projections that stick up. Right, all of these, those are all the dermal papilla. And then the parts of the epidermis that extend down are the epidermal ridges. You guys see that there is both thick skin and thin skin represented on this model. Right, the thin skin is over here. There's a thin stratum corneum, so like the little tan layer on the top is pretty thin. And there's no stratum lucidum. Notice the white line that's present over here stops. It does not continue into the thin skin. So there are only 4 layers in the thin skin. The thick skin is over here. It has a really thick stratum corneum. And it has this white line. That's representing the stratum lucidum. So let's go ahead and identify the layers that are present in the epidermis. Remember, they are boys say girls like clothes. So the bottom layer, this dark purple line that you see, is the stratum basale. Then this thicker light area right here is the stratum spinosum. This dark purple line right here is the stratum granulosum. The white line is showing you the stratum lucidum. And then this whole thick outer portion is the stratum corneum. All right, hopefully that is super comfortable for you guys. I would go through and just kind of practice labeling this on your own. We'll get to all of these other structures that you see in the next video. Thanks for watching.